Hi everyone, and welcome to this week's class notes. This week we are reading poetry by William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge, two romantic poets. And so because we are, I'd like to really focus this week in more detail than we have so far this semester on how to read poetry and the kinds of questions you should ask when you're analyzing poems. So poems offer unique challenges. This week, as I just mentioned, we are for the first time reading two self-contained poems written in modern English. Previously, we'd read parts of longer epic poems or poems written not in what we would think of as modern English. So I think because we're reading these poems this week, now is a good time for us to focus further on what makes poetry unique and on how to read it. Often we view poetry as unapproachable and so dense with hidden meaning as to be beyond understanding. But with some initial groundwork, you can go a long way towards understanding a poem and how that poem achieves its effects by asking some fundamental questions about a poem. So what we'll be talking about here, it's not really detailed, specific language for discussing things like different poetic forms or meter or rhyme, some of the more technical aspects. Instead, it's more about how to ask some basic questions of a poem that will lead you through conducting a full analysis, but in a way that will help guide you to think about both the content and the form of the poem. So as an example, we'll actually use a poem by William Wordsworth. This is one that's in our textbook. It's a poem called London, 1802. So I'm going to read it here, and then we'll keep referring back to it. It is on page 1593 in our Norton text. So the poem, again, is London, 1802. Milton, thou shouldst be living at this hour. England hath need of thee. She is a fen of stagnant waters, altar, sword, and pen, fireside, the heroic wealth of hall and bower have forfeited their ancient English dower of inward happiness. We are selfish men. Oh, raise us up, return to us again, and give us manners, virtue, freedom, power. Thy soul was like a star, and dwelt apart. Thou hadst a voice, whose sound was like the sea, pure as the naked heavens, majestic, free. So didst thou travel on life's common way, in cheerful godliness, and yet thy heart thy lowliest duties on herself did lay. So here's a good example of a poem where you read it, and at first glance its meaning isn't obvious, what it's about isn't completely obvious. It takes a few rereadings to really start to get at and understand what's happening in here. And so the more you can do that, the better you can begin to appreciate it and understand it. So the first thing to start with is your initial response. So how did this poem make me feel? What did it make me think of? How did I respond to it after a first and after subsequent readings? So that's where you should begin. It's just as you were reading it, that first kind of gut level response. What were you feeling? What were you thinking? What did it remind you of? While I'm reading it here, I'm noticing words like, that are standing out to me about England. There's a sense of kind of sadness or loss in the poem that's really hitting me. There's almost like this plaintive cry being made by the speaker. And so these feelings of sort of loss, of despair, of calling out are what really kind of hit me on that first reading. But that first initial response will be different for everyone. And that's where you kind of want to start with that personal response that you have to it before you go any further. And the reason why you want to start there is so that you can start to understand how the poem evoked that response from you. And as you start to think more about the poem and study it in more detail, your thoughts about the poem will shift. But a good starting point is with that initial gut response. So starting with your own reactions to the poem is a great place to begin. If you were confused, startled, upset, angered, becalmed, overjoyed, or whatever other gamut of responses you had to it, then you should acknowledge that. By first focusing on your own reactions to the poem, you can move to the rest of the questions that you'll ask, all of which will help you to answer what about the poem and how it was written caused me to respond the way that it did. So these first questions are the only ones that are really focused on your subjective response. All the other questions require that you look at the poem in detail and use details from the poem to support your answers to those questions. So with that said, the next thing you want to ask about is the subject matter of the poem. What is the poem about? What's the subject of the poem? The theme. If it's a long poem, is there more than one subject or theme? You should be able to express this in a phrase or two. So here we have a poem titled London 1802. So on some sort of obvious level, it seems like the poem is about London and a specific point in time in history. And by using that title, Wordsworth is drawing our attention to that fact. It also seems to be about the poet John Milton, right? And the reference right there in that first word to Milton. So there's something in there about Milton. And here what I've included as an image is a painting of London composed by a famous English painter. This is a little bit later than the publication date of the poem, but it still gives you kind of a reference point. Now this is obviously more of a sort of pastoral, idyllic image of London. You can see London sort of off in the distant, in some of the haze. This is a painting taken from or composed from the point of view of a park that's near London. But that's what the poem seems to be about, right? Is the state of London in 1802 and what that's evoking for the speaker there. So who is that speaker? Who is speaking? Just as you would ask with a work of prose, try to determine who is speaking in a poem. Depending on the poem, sometimes there might be a single voice speaking, but sometimes there might be multiple voices. What can you tell about the speaking voice or voices? Is there a primary voice speaking? Based on what is in the poem, can we tell anything about that speaker? Is the poem clearly creating a speaker or set of speakers who is not identified with the author of the poem? If the poem seems to be spoken using the voice of the poet, what version of the poet's identity are you hearing? So be careful. Even when a poem seems to be written in the voice of the poet, you should never write about the poem as if we are hearing directly from the poet. Every poem speaks with its own voice, even if that voice is a version of the poet's identity. So there are poems when clearly the speaker is not the poet at all, and it seems to be some other person, perhaps a character within the poem, perhaps someone very much unlike the poet, or perhaps the point of view is not obviously the poet's point of view. So you can't just say, well, the speaker here is the poet, because even if the poet, though the poet is the one who composed the poem, that doesn't make them the speaker. Now, with a lot of romantic poetry, the poet is inviting us as readers to identify the speaker with the poet, him or herself. So here, you could say that the speaker is Wordsworth, or more precisely, a version of Wordsworth, and he's inviting that comparison. Wordsworth does that with a lot of his poetry, as do a lot of romantic poets. But you should always distinguish between those, the poet and the speaker, and ask yourself who was talking here, and just based on what I see in the poem, what can I tell about that person? Here, clearly the person speaking is someone who's concerned with the state of London, someone who feels some kind of companionship or affinity with John Milton and speaks to him directly. Someone who has a command of language, right? We see that with the poetic diction in here. So there are still things you can learn about a speaker. Even if the speaker doesn't give us clues about their character, you can still tell a lot about how they speak, the references that they make. And those are the kinds of clues that you'd want to look for. So the image here is an image of Wordsworth, a sketch of him. Now, you also want to ask who's the speaker talking to. So that's the audience. Who's being spoken to? So sometimes poems will be written as if they are being spoken to a specific audience that is not necessarily the same as the people who are actually reading it. Such as, for example, imagining a poem spoken by a queen to her subjects, or one spoken by a mouse to the piece of cheese it's about to eat. Does the poem give any indication of a specific audience hearing its words? Even if it doesn't, is the poem making any assumptions about the experiences and background knowledge of its audience? So always you're going to have some sense of, all right, there's a larger audience here, right? And we're reading this poem, so we're part of that audience. He is speaking to a larger audience. But one thing that makes this poem really interesting and unique in some ways is that he is also identifying in the poem one individual that he is talking to. He says right in the beginning, Milton, exclamation point. He's calling to John Milton. Now, John Milton's dead, right? So he's speaking to the sort of spirit of John Milton, or what John Milton represents. He's not actually talking to him. And yet he is invoking a specific listener to what he has to say there, while he is also aware that he is writing to a larger audience above and beyond John Milton, who are sort of listening in on this plea that he's making to Milton. Now, the situation and setting. So you want to ask next, what's the situation of the poem? Is there anything happening in the poem? Are there characters or people described in the poem? What are they doing? Is there any story being told? What is it? Now here, there isn't really a situation. If you look in your textbook, the footnote to the poem explains that, and this is using Wordsworth's own words, that Wordsworth composed the poem shortly after returning to England from France, where, and now I'm quoting from Wordsworth, Wordsworth says, "When I could not be but struck, as here described, with the vanity and parade of our own country, as contrasted with the quiet and I may say the desolation that the Revolution had produced in France." So there's sort of a larger context, a larger situation here that isn't directly referenced by the poem, but that Wordsworth notes, and that is about contrasting what's happening in England at this time with the consequences for the French Revolution in France that he himself personally witnessed. So there's not really a story or a particular context that's described within the poem, and yet there is this larger context that people would have been aware of at the time, that Wordsworth himself notes, and that the date 1802 does also allude to by really setting this poem within a specific time period. So that also correlates then to the setting of the poem. Is there any sense of a time and or place depicted in the poem? And again, the title really anchors it very specifically in a time and a place. Not all poems do that. This poem does. It's titled that. So we're in a certain time, certain place. The sketch I have here is of London. This sketch is from several decades after 1802, but still it evokes the sense of the busyness of the city, the urbanity of it, the architecture. What is the world that the poem is set in, and how important is that world to the poem as a whole? Now, even though this poem is set in London in 1802, we actually don't get much description of London itself. The poem doesn't really talk much about the people in the streets, the buildings, what's happening. It evokes that idea without really describing it in detail. So it's dependent on this clear sense of setting, even though it doesn't really focus on that setting. So there's an interesting sort of tension there between those two things. So the next thing to really think about is the language, the words that are being used. How are words used in the poem, and what words stand out? What is the significance of the poem's word choice? So when we get to this point, we can spend a lot of time going line by line talking about the language of a poem, and that's one of the important steps you should take when you're analyzing a poem. So in poetry, you should always pay particular attention to the syntax, that's the sentence structure, the word choice, and the arrangement of words. What words stick out to you? Why? How are those words being used? What words are being used to carry an additional meaning beyond their dictionary definition? That is, to connote, so suggest through association or emotional resonance, or symbolize, contain a meaning beyond their literal one. Something beyond what they denote, how they're defined in the dictionary. So in other words, think about both the dictionary definition of words, but then also what those words suggest, what ideas they evoke in your mind, what emotional resonance they might have, what they might represent that's figurative or symbolic. Do you notice any patterns of figurative language, such as metaphors or similes? And now here, there's a whole complex language describing different forms of figurative language that we're not going to get into here, but that literary scholars use to help them distinguish amongst many different kinds of figurative language. So just to get into one brief example of this, I've here pulled out one quote from the poem. This is starting on line 2 of the poem. England hath need of thee. And he's speaking, the thee there is, he's talking to Milton, right? So he's saying, England needs you, Milton. She is a fen of stagnant waters, altar, sword, and pen. Fireside, the heroic wealth of hall and bower, have forfeited their ancient English dower of inward happiness. So I chose these lines because I found myself noticing, a few things here about the language. First of all, you have some of these words that really evoke a strong sense of what to me seems like this like very English sounding words and English images of the countryside of England's past. That word fen is one that I had a kind of sense of what that meant, but I actually looked it up online, and it refers to a kind of wetland. So it's an area that's dry land, but that's fairly moist and has water moving in and out of it. So that fen of stagnant waters is this image of the sort of like dry land, but that also has water that's not moving, right? Stagnant's a really strong word there. Stagnant is, it's still, it's sort of lifeless, right? It's lacking the rhythm of movement, the rhythm of life. So there's some really strong language there. That word fen is one of those words that, you could have said marshland, for example, or some other word that means something similar, but fen is a very particular kind of word. When he talks about altar, sword, and pen, look at how concrete those words are. The fireside, right? Very simple language, and yet they're words that evoke some kind of a history, right? These images, like this altar, right? This sort of slab of stone, or some kind of elemental material that sacrifices are made upon, or offerings are made. Sword, right? You've got this image of strength, of power, of fighting. Pen, right? Isn't it interesting that sword and pen are sort of linked together there? Fireside, right? The hearth, that evokes images of the home, right? Of warmth, of comfort. And then the heroic wealth of hall and bower. I mean, to me, these images go all the way back to thinking about Beowulf, right? And the sort of roaring fireplace within that mead hall. The hall is a sort of communal site. And then the bower is another word that I looked up. I actually looked up in the Oxford English Dictionary. And a bower is a kind of home or hearth. Now that's a dictionary definition, but it also connotes or suggests images of simplicity, of packed dirt, of natural materials, of the countryside, right? So again, these are words that evoke very particular images of England's history and a certain version of England. And he's talking about how England has forfeited her ancient English dower. And dower in the textbook is just described as an endowment or a gift. So we've given up this gift of inward happiness. So there's a lot more we could say about these lines and about the whole poem. But what you want to try to do is talk through, think about why are these words being used. Look at the words that really stick with you, that draw your attention in, that resonate with you in some way. And ask yourself why. Why those words have so much power within this poem. Look up words that you don't know. Understand what those words mean. And then also look at things like punctuation. Like here, we have multiple use of colons after the word the, after the word waters. There's other places in the poem that uses colons. That's an interesting choice. So you should be asking why. Why the use of these colons? Why are they being used there in that way? You also want to think about the poem's organization. How is the poem organized? So how does it begin? What happens from there and there and there? In other words, just kind of going through the sequence of the poem and asking yourself, in what order do things happen, or what order? Is there some sort of underlying organization behind the different parts of the poem? How does it end? Is there any kind of pattern to how the reader moves through the poem? Any logic that suggests an underlying pattern? So, for example, perhaps it organizes a description in a specific manner, or tells a story, or uses some kind of argumentative logic, or moves through the pattern of the speaker's emotional responses to an event. So here we don't really have a story that's being told. There's nothing being described. It's the speaker trying to speak back to Milton. And so if you look back at the poem, you can see that there are different parts to the poem. In the opening, he evokes Milton. He talks about why England needs Milton. And in the lines I was just talking about in the previous slide, he evokes these sort of ancient images of England as a place of home, of fire, of sword, of pen, of the countryside, right, of happiness. And then from there he talks about we are selfish men. So there's a shift. Now he's talking about modern London. Oh, raise us up, return to us again, and give us manners, virtue, freedom, power. So he's saying, look, here's what we used to have. Here's what you can return to us. Thy soul was like a star and dwelt apart. And from that point forward, from that line, he talks about Milton himself, and the focus shifts to praising Milton. From that point forward, he's basically focused on Milton as a poet and a certain kind of poet. So there is definitely an organization going on here. You might say there's basically like 3 parts to the poem. Structure. Now, structure is different from organization. By structure, we mean, does the poem use any recognizable poetic forms? Why might it use those forms? So you want to try to figure out, is this using some kind of a traditional form that I can recognize? Now, again, there's a lot of different language for talking about this that's very specific to literary analysis. We're not going to go into all of that, but this poem happens to conform to a particular poetic form. So here, this is a sonnet. It's identified as a sonnet within your textbook. It's listed in a section of sonnets. Sonnet is a very old form used by many poets that you could, if you were going to write more about this poem, you'd want to research some more about. You'd want to try to understand what's the sonnet form, where does it come from, why is it used, what's its typical subject matter. I provided an example here. It's a really fun example of actually a modern sonnet by a poet named Billy Collins, where the sonnet that he writes is actually about sonnets. So you'd want to understand, okay, then once you've identified that it's a sonnet, you can ask some further questions. Well, why does he use a sonnet here? Is he using that form in its traditional way? Is he doing anything different from it? You could look at the rhyme scheme, and there is a rhyme scheme in Wordsworth's poem that you could pay attention to and ask yourself, okay, so based on the rhyme scheme, is it fitting in with a typical sonnet form or not? What else makes it like a sonnet or not like a sonnet? And so looking for those small variations gives you some sense of how Wordsworth might be emphasizing certain words or ideas or passages within the poem. You also want to pay attention to the sound of the poem. That's one of the things that makes poetry very unique, is that the sounds in your mouth when you're speaking that poem out loud have as much to do with the overall impact of the poem as the meanings of the words themselves. So how does the poem sound when spoken out loud? You should always read a poem out loud. We've been talking about this all year long. Poetry is an oral literary form that achieves many of its effects through the way it sounds in your ear. So do you notice a pattern of repeating sound effects, consonants or vowels, rhymes, hard, harsh sounds, or silky, slithery sounds? Rhythms in the way each line sounds, repeating patterns in the rise and fall of your voice. And here you should be hearing that within a sonnet, because a sonnet uses, traditionally, iambic pentameter. So in a sonnet, typically what you'll see are lines that are 10 syllables long with a rising and falling pattern of stress and unstress. We saw this same pattern in Shakespeare's play Othello. Again, there is a vast vocabulary for describing these aural effects, these sound effects. So you can draw on terms that you're familiar with in discussing this aspect of the poem and trying to understand, most importantly, what the relationship is between what a poem is saying and how it sounds. That is, its sound and sense. So think about a word like, in the passage that I had been analyzing in terms of its use of language, that's a good passage to also talk about in terms of the sounds of some of those words. Words like altar, sword, pen, fireside, right? Single syllable or double syllable words with, you've got the W sound in there, the D, the P, the N, very sort of strong, fireside, right? That sort of simple Anglo-Saxon language, right? That evokes some of these very simple ideas, right? You hear some of that in the language, hall and bower. So you want to put these words in your mouth, speak them out loud. What do these sound like? What are you hearing? You also want to look at the layout and design of a poem. What does the poem look like on the page? So when you're looking at it, do you notice anything about it? Even though many of poetry's characteristics derive from the fact that poems were once an exclusively oral form, a major component of poetry's expressive power comes from how it looks on the page. How does the poem use stanza breaks and line breaks? How is it laid out visually on the page? How does it use font style or other visual cues to influence how you read it? So there's not too much going on here. I think what's interesting is that you could see how it's sort of, the sonnet emphasizes that it's kind of like this one piece, right? There's no stanza breaks. In some sonnets, you will see a stanza break after the eighth line, but here you don't. So, but some poems will do a lot more in terms of playing around with line breaks, stanza breaks, layout on the page, design, especially when you get into more contemporary poetry. So it's something you should be looking for is what does it look like on the page?